Thermopylae is often remembered through the image of slow-motion Spartans from the film 300, but the historical reality was far more extraordinary precisely because it actually happened. In 480 before Christ, the Greek world was divided among city-states that could scarcely agree on anything. Those quarreling communities were suddenly confronted by the greatest empire anyone had yet seen. King Xerxes of Persia was advancing into Europe at the head of an army so enormous that later stories said it could drink rivers dry. Behind it came a fleet large enough to turn the horizon dark. Thermopylae was therefore not simply a tale of 300 warriors standing heroically in a narrow pass. It was the first move in a desperate, ingenious, and disorderly struggle for survival. At the same time, a political operator named Themistocles was preparing a naval snare so audacious that it would eventually transform the entire war. The familiar story from the film captures only a small part of what happened. The real campaign involved grand imperial ambition, political infighting, extraordinary engineering, and a Greek resistance that was far less united than later legend suggests. To understand how the invasion began, we have to return to the spring of 480 before Christ. King Xerxes of Persia had reached the western edge of his empire and was preparing to move into Europe. His army was waiting while Persian engineers attempted something that seemed almost impossible. They were building two enormous bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow stretch of water separating Asia from Europe, in the area now associated with the Dardanelles. These were not ordinary bridges. Hundreds of boats were tied together side by side using thick ropes made from materials such as flax and papyrus. Wooden planks were then laid across the vessels, creating a floating roadway broad enough for an entire army to cross. The project was an astonishing feat of organization and engineering. If it succeeded, soldiers, horses, equipment, and supplies could pass from Asia into Europe without relying on a long and vulnerable sea voyage. But the first attempt was destroyed by a storm. Xerxes responded in a way that revealed much about his character and his understanding of kingship. He ordered the waters themselves to be punished. The Hellespont was whipped, and the men responsible for the bridge were punished as well. To a modern observer, the episode sounds bizarre, but within the logic of imperial power, it sent a clear message. Nothing, not even nature, was supposed to defy the Persian king. The Persians then built a second bridge, and this time the construction held. Xerxes had refused to accept failure. When the first bridge collapsed, he did not abandon the expedition or retreat from the problem. He ordered the work to be repeated until it functioned. That determination mattered. The crossing was more than a practical solution to a geographical obstacle. It was a public display of Persian power. The empire was not merely entering Europe, it was demonstrating that the king could command the landscape itself. The water had failed to stop him, and even the sea appeared to have been forced into obedience. Xerxes was not beginning an entirely new conflict. He was continuing a campaign that his father, Darius, had started. Several Greek communities in Ionia, on the coast of what is now Turkey, had rebelled against Persian rule. Athens and Eretria supported that uprising, and Darius decided that both cities needed to be punished. His expedition against them ended disastrously. In 490 before Christ, Athenian troops defeated the Persian force at Marathon. The result was a humiliating setback for the Persian Empire, and Darius died before he could organize another attempt. His son Xerxes inherited the throne and the unfinished objective. He now intended to return with a force powerful enough to settle the matter permanently. The Persian Empire stretched across immense territories in Asia and Africa, making it vastly larger than anything the European Greeks had ever encountered. Xerxes could draw troops and resources from many different regions under Persian control. The coming invasion was not simply a raid aimed at one city. It was an imperial operation designed to crush resistance, punish those who had opposed Persia, and bring the Greek mainland within the reach of the king. The size of Xerxes' army is one of the most disputed parts of the story. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that more than 2 million soldiers took part in the invasion. That figure has generally been considered an exaggeration. It would have been extremely difficult to feed, move, and coordinate such a vast number of people in the ancient world. Modern historians commonly place the army somewhere around 200,000 or 300,000 troops, although the exact total remains uncertain. Even the lower estimates describe a force of extraordinary size. It was still probably the largest army assembled in the known world up to that time, and it greatly outnumbered any force the Greek city-states could field on their own. The army was not made up of Persians alone. It represented the breadth of the empire that Xerxes ruled. Persians marched alongside Assyrians, Indians, Egyptians, and soldiers from many other subject peoples and allied territories. Each group brought its own equipment, customs, and methods of fighting. There were heavily armed infantrymen, archers, cavalry, engineers, and specialists responsible for the vast logistical effort behind the invasion. The army was a moving collection of different military traditions, all gathered under the authority of one monarch. The Persian expedition also depended on a powerful navy. Warships accompanied the advance, carrying troops and supplies while protecting the coastal route. The fleet was essential because an army of this size could not survive on marching alone. Food, weapons, animals, and replacement equipment had to be transported and distributed across enormous distances. The ships also gave Xerxes the ability to threaten Greek coastal communities and to support his troops as they moved southwards. The army and navy were therefore parts of one enormous machine, built to bring the full weight of the Persian Empire into Greece. That combination of numbers, resources, and organization created a crisis for the Greeks. The city-states had no single ruler and no unified government. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the other communities often competed with one another, and their political interests did not always align. Some Greeks were prepared to resist Persia, while others were willing to negotiate or submit. Even among those who recognized the danger, agreement over strategy was difficult. They were being asked to cooperate against an empire that was richer, larger, and more centralized than any power they had previously faced. Athens understood that its position was especially dangerous. The city had already helped provoke Persian anger by supporting the Ionian revolt, and its soldiers had defeated Darius at Marathon. Xerxes' invasion was therefore connected directly to the earlier conflict. Athens was not an accidental target caught in someone else's war. It stood among the communities that Persia intended to punish. Yet the Athenians also faced a difficult military reality. Their city could not match the Persian army in a conventional land battle, and the size of the approaching force made the defense of every road and settlement impossible. The question was how the Greeks could use their own advantages against such an overwhelming enemy. The Persian army needed roads, passes, water, food, and a route that could support its advance. Its navy also needed open waters in which to operate. A force of immense size was powerful, but it was not weightless. The larger it became, the more supplies it consumed, and the more difficult it was to maneuver through narrow terrain. The Greeks would have to make geography and timing do the work that their numbers could not. This was where the narrow pass of Thermopylae became so important. The route between the mountains and the sea restricted the number of soldiers who could fight at once. In such a place, a smaller Greek force could prevent the entire Persian army from bringing its full strength to bear. The pass could not destroy Xerxes' army by itself, but it could slow the invasion and buy time. That time mattered because the defense of the land route had to be coordinated with the movement of the Greek fleet. Thermopylae was part of a wider plan, not an isolated act of sacrifice. The same principle applied at sea. A larger fleet did not automatically guarantee victory in waters where ships could be crowded together, confused, or trapped. Persian naval power was immense, but the fleet had to navigate around headlands, maintain its supply lines, and operate in waters that the Greeks understood better. Themistocles, the Athenian politician at the center of the naval strategy, recognized that the Greeks could not defeat Persia simply by meeting its fleet in open water. He needed to draw the Persian ships into conditions where their numerical advantage became a burden. His approach was bold because it relied on deception as much as force. The Greeks would try to shape Xerxes' decisions, encourage the Persian fleet to move where they wanted it, and then use confined waters to prevent the larger force from fighting effectively. Themistocles was not a straightforward military hero. He was a political mastermind, an opportunist, and a constant source of trouble to his opponents. His plan required nerve, manipulation, and a willingness to gamble the survival of Athens on a strategy that could easily have failed. Before that naval trap could be sprung, however, the Persian advance had to be confronted on land. Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont, brought together soldiers from across his empire, and demonstrated that storms and physical obstacles would not persuade him to stop. His army was now moving into the Greek world, while the communities facing him struggled to turn rivalry into cooperation. The famous stand at Thermopylae would soon give the invasion its most memorable scene, but the battle's significance depended on everything surrounding it: the unfinished revenge of Darius, the scale of Xerxes' mobilization, the political divisions among the Greeks, and the careful link between a mountain pass and a naval battlefield. Put the Persians and the Indians together, and you have a force capable of almost anything. The fleet was enormous as well. Estimates place it at somewhere between 600 and 1,200 vessels, with much of it crewed by Phoenicians, who were famous throughout the ancient world for their skill as sailors and warriors at sea. All of these peoples were, at least politically, living under Persian rule. So who exactly was this vast imperial force about to face? A collection of Greek city-states that spent much of their time quarreling with one another and nursing old grudges. More than 1,000 of these communities were scattered across the landscape we now associate with Greece. Each had its own government, its own army, and usually a particular rival it disliked intensely. The Greek term for a city-state was polis. In practice, a polis was a small, independent nation, a city, together with the surrounding land, governing itself and making its own decisions. These communities shared a language and worshipped the same gods, but that did not mean they thought of themselves as one unified people. Someone from Athens saw himself as an Athenian, someone from Sparta was a Spartan, while a person from Corinth identified as Corinthian. They did not generally look across the whole country and say, "We are all Greek." That kind of local identity was common in the ancient world. Even much later, people living in what would eventually become one country could remain fiercely attached to their own city or region. Italians, for example, could think of themselves as Neapolitans or Milanese before thinking of themselves as Italian. The idea of a single national identity was unusual, especially at this time, and the Greeks were no exception. For generations, their city-states had fought one another, sometimes over territory, sometimes over power, and sometimes simply because hostility had become part of the political landscape. Athens, however, had been transformed since the Battle of Marathon, when its forces had defeated the Persians. A sharp and ambitious politician named Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to use the wealth from a newly discovered silver deposit to build a navy. The question was what to do with this sudden income. Themistocles argued that it should be turned into military strength, and Athens began constructing triremes, the swift-oared warships of the ancient Mediterranean. These vessels depended on roughly 170 rowers apiece. By 480 years before the Common Era, Athens possessed around 200 triremes, making it the strongest naval power in Greece. Militarily, the Athenians were beginning to dominate the sea. They also possessed something else that was unusual for the period: demokratia, or democracy. This was not democracy in the modern sense, because political participation was restricted. The citizens who could vote were free men, and in practice, the system particularly favored men who owned land. Even so, these citizens could vote directly on the laws that would govern them. In many other Greek states, power rested with a king or with an oligarchy, meaning that a relatively small group of wealthy and influential men controlled the government. Athens had developed a system in which its eligible citizens could take a much more direct role in public decisions. Sparta, by contrast, was almost the complete opposite of Athens. It was a society organized around military power, and that system rested on the labor of the Helots. The Helots were an enslaved population who worked the land and produced the food that allowed Spartan citizens to devote themselves to warfare. In effect, the Spartans transferred much of the ordinary work of life to a conquered people, leaving their own citizens free to train, fight, and maintain the state's military system. The Helots were largely descended from communities that Sparta had conquered. They also greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. That imbalance meant Sparta lived under the constant threat of revolt. If an enslaved population becomes vastly larger than the ruling class can never feel entirely secure. At any moment, a rebellion could spread and overwhelm the society that depended on its labor. This danger was one of the reasons Sparta remained so heavily militarized. Its soldiers had to be ready not only to fight enemies from outside, but also to suppress resistance from within. Spartan boys entered the military system at the age of 7. They were removed from ordinary family life and raised in a harsh training regime, living in communal barracks for much of their youth. At 20, they became full soldiers, and at 30 they received full citizenship. Even after marrying, they were expected to continue living in the military barracks for years. Their lives were structured around discipline, obedience, and combat. Their duties included defending Sparta against foreign enemies, but they also included keeping the Helots and other conquered peoples under control. The Spartans were the only full-time soldiers in Greece. Their training was designed to make them fight as a single body rather than as a crowd of individuals. They advanced shoulder to shoulder, shield beside shield, each man depending on the others to keep the formation intact. These soldiers were known as hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen who fought in a close formation called a phalanx. The phalanx was one of the most recognizable tactics of Greek warfare. The soldiers moved forward in dense ranks, their large shields overlapping so that the men in front were protected and the rows behind them were covered as well. From a distance, it could look like a moving wall of bronze and wood, or a great armored shell made from human beings. If one soldier fell, the man behind him could step forward and close the gap, keeping the line intact. The strength of the formation came from its unity. A hoplite was protecting not only himself, but also the man beside him, and the whole group relied on every individual maintaining his position. The Spartan way of life impressed other Greeks, but it also unsettled them. Spartans were seen as intensely serious, secretive, disciplined, and perhaps a little strange. Their fellow Greeks respected their courage and their battlefield skill, yet many also thought they took military life to an extreme. The Spartans were rather like the severe, intimidating outsiders of the ancient Greek world, admirable in some ways, but not necessarily the people you wanted setting the rules for everyone else. The military balance within Greece was therefore divided. Sparta had the finest land army, while Athens had developed the most powerful navy. In theory, that combination could have created an almost unbeatable defense. In reality, the two states distrusted one another deeply. They were both Greek, but that shared identity did not erase their rivalry. Athens and Sparta had different political systems, different values, and different ideas about what leadership should look like. Working together was difficult even when the danger was obvious. Then came news that Xerxes and the Persian forces were moving into Europe. The army appeared to stretch across the horizon, an immense imperial host made up of soldiers from many different lands. The scale of the invasion forced every Greek city-state to make a choice. One option was to submit, acknowledge Persian authority, and hope to avoid destruction. The other was to resist, knowing that defeat might bring complete ruin. Many communities chose submission. From their point of view, the situation seemed straightforward. The Persian army was so large that resistance might mean certain death, whereas surrender could allow at least some of the population to survive. There was also a practical reason to consider that option. The Persian Empire often permitted conquered peoples to keep their local customs, religious practices, and forms of government, provided they paid tribute and accepted the authority of the Persian king. Persian rule could therefore operate through local administrations rather than replacing every institution outright. A conquered state might continue to manage many of its own affairs, but it was expected to send money and resources to the empire and to recognize the king's supremacy. This approach was not unique in imperial history. Powerful empires frequently found it more efficient to collect tribute and demand obedience than to interfere with every detail of local life. For communities facing an overwhelming army, submission could appear less like cowardice and more like a way of preserving what they could. Resistance, however, was treated very differently. A city that openly opposed Persia risked not merely losing its independence, but suffering total destruction. Thebes and much of Boeotia offered the traditional tokens of surrender, earth and water, symbolizing their acceptance of Persian rule. Thessaly was unable to defend its northern frontier and fell quickly before the Persian cavalry. Argos remained largely neutral, refusing to commit itself fully to either side. Further south, some of the city-states in the Peloponnese argued that the best course was to fortify the Isthmus of Corinth. They wanted to abandon the territory north of that defensive line, including Athens, and concentrate their forces where the narrow passage could be held. It was a brutally practical proposal. If the Persians were going to advance, perhaps the southern Greeks could save themselves by giving up the communities in the north. The debate revealed just how divided the Greek world remained. Every city had to weigh its own survival against the possibility of a united resistance, and there was no agreement about where the defense should begin or how much territory could realistically be protected. Political disputes, old rivalries, fear, and competing military priorities all complicated the response. The Persians were approaching, yet the Greeks were still arguing over what kind of war they were willing to fight. Eventually, though, a coalition began to take shape. Athens and Sparta were the two most powerful military states in Greece, and despite their mutual suspicion, both recognized that neither could face the Persian invasion alone. They agreed to lead a common defense. Corinth, Megara, and several smaller states joined them, contributing whatever troops and resources they could spare. The alliance was far from united in spirit, and its members did not suddenly forget their old rivalries, but for the moment they had a shared enemy and a reason to stand together. They did send messengers pleading for assistance, but most of the cities either refused outright or contributed only token contingents, perhaps a few hundred men who would arrive, stand about for a while, and hardly change the balance of power. For the defense of Thermopylae, the Greek alliance gathered roughly 7,000 soldiers. At sea, it could call upon about 370 ships, the greater part of them supplied by Athens. To see why the Greeks chose the positions they did, it helps to picture the geography. Xerxes' army had crossed from Asia into Europe at the Hellespont and was advancing southwards along the coast towards central Greece. The invasion route passed through several crucial points. First came the crossing into Europe. Then there was Thermopylae, whose name means the Hot Gates, a narrow passage squeezed between the sea and steep mountain slopes. Finally, there was Salamis, a small island close to Athens, surrounded by waters narrow enough to turn a large fleet into a liability. Those three locations, the crossing, the defensive stand, and the place where the invasion might be turned back, would shape the entire campaign. Two of them offered the Greeks a genuine possibility of survival. Thermopylae could block the Persian advance on land, while the waters around Euboea could restrict the enemy fleet at sea. If the Greeks held those positions long enough for the alliance to remain together, they might still resist the empire despite being vastly outnumbered. If either position collapsed too quickly, and especially if both were lost, Greece was effectively finished. By the beginning of summer, Xerxes and his enormous army had crossed into Europe. The columns moved through Macedonia, while the Persian fleet traveled alongside them, following the coastline. One city after another surrendered without putting up a serious fight. Then, towards the end of August, Persian scouts returned with news for their king. A small Greek force had taken up position in the pass at Thermopylae. The man selected to command that defense was Leonidas, one of Sparta's two kings. He was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, and by that stage he was a hardened veteran. His whole life had prepared him for a moment such as this. From the age of 7, he had been placed within Sparta's military training system, shaped specifically for service to the state. He had already taken part in numerous campaigns, and he understood what the coming battle would demand. A Spartan king was not expected to remain safely behind the lines, issuing orders from a distance. He led from the front. He was a living symbol of the Spartan ideal. This is who we are, these are our people, and we will fight alongside them. The king was expected to show that he was willing to face danger before anyone else. The Spartans were intensely disciplined, fiercely loyal to one another, and bound by a strict reverence for their laws and military traditions. Leonidas also understood the likely outcome before he ever set out. According to the ancient tradition, he looked towards his wife, Gorgo, and told her to marry a good man and raise strong children, because he did not expect to return. It is an extraordinary thing to imagine, looking at the woman you love and telling her that this is goodbye, that the time you shared has come to an end, and that she must go on with her life. He was not asking her to wait for him, he was telling her to find happiness elsewhere, to choose a good husband, and to bring up children who would carry their family forward. That grim expectation made sense when the sight itself is considered. Thermopylae, the hot gates, did not look in antiquity as it does today. Modern visitors can see a broad coastal plain and may wonder why the location was considered such a powerful defensive position. But in 480 before Christ, the shoreline lay much closer to the mountains. At its narrowest point, the passage was only around 25 or 30 feet across. Steep cliffs rose on one side, while the sea fell away on the other. It was exactly the sort of natural bottleneck where a small body of soldiers could prevent a much larger army from passing. Leonidas brought 300 Spartans with him. These were not randomly selected troops gathered at the last moment. They were his personal guard, men chosen for the task and regarded as among Sparta's finest. There was another important condition attached to their selection. Each of them had a son who could continue the family line. For the ancient Spartans, preserving the bloodline mattered enormously. A man who had not yet fathered a child could potentially be excused from a mission from which he was unlikely to return. But once he had a son, the situation was different. That son could carry on the household name and lineage. To a modern mind, it may seem that having a child would make a soldier more determined to survive. In the Spartan system, the logic could run almost completely in the opposite direction. Once a man had a son, he was considered to have fulfilled his duty to the future of his family. His line would continue even if he died at Thermopylae. So those 300 men went to the pass with their descendants already secured. They were not alone. Alongside the Spartans stood several thousand other Greek soldiers. Ancient accounts place the wider force somewhere between roughly 5,000 and 7,000 men. The contingents included soldiers from nearby Greek communities, among them Thebans and Thespians, as well as forces associated with other surrounding regions and islands. Estimates vary, but the essential point remains the same. The defenders were a modest coalition facing an army of extraordinary size. Before the Persian arrival, the Greeks repaired an old wall running across the pass. It was not an impressive fortification by later standards, but in that confined landscape, it helped create a fixed defensive position. Once the wall had been restored and the troops arranged behind it, they waited for Xerxes. When the Persian army finally appeared, the king sent scouts ahead to examine the Greek position. What those scouts witnessed must have seemed deeply strange. The Spartans did not look as though they were panicking, preparing to flee, or scrambling to reinforce the wall. Instead, some of them were exercising. Others were combing or arranging their hair. They appeared relaxed, almost indifferent, while the greatest army most of them had ever seen approached the pass. To the Persian observers, this behavior was baffling. They were looking at men who seemed to be grooming themselves and carrying on with ordinary routines instead of displaying fear. The Spartans, however, were not being careless. Their calm formed part of a ritual preparation for battle, treating the hours before combat as a solemn period rather than surrendering to frantic excitement. Xerxes asked Demaratus, a former Spartan king who had been driven into exile and now lived at the Persian court, to explain what he was seeing. Demaratus told him that the Spartans were preparing to fight to the death. Their apparent idleness was not evidence that they had failed to understand the danger. They knew exactly what was coming. For men expecting to die, those final hours could be spent in an unusual way. Rather than exhausting themselves in fear and agitation, they groomed themselves, exercised, and took in the world around them. They behaved as though they were making use of their last days because, in all likelihood, they were. The composure the Persians saw was therefore not weakness or ignorance. It was the outward expression of a culture that had trained its soldiers to meet death without allowing terror to control them. Xerxes did not attack immediately. For approximately 4 days, he waited, apparently assuming that the Greeks would lose their nerve. Perhaps they would retreat once the scale of the Persian force became clear. Perhaps enough men would desert to make resistance impossible. Perhaps the coalition would surrender without requiring a major battle. None of those things happened. On the 5th day, Xerxes ordered his troops into the pass. The first assault was made by the Medes, experienced and confident soldiers who were expected to break the small Greek force. Their reputation and numbers, however, meant little inside such a restricted space. The Greek line held. The hoplites formed a dense wall of shields, with spears thrusting through the gaps. Seen from the front, the formation behaved almost like a single armored machine. Each soldier carried a large wooden shield faced with bronze, known as an aspis, and wore bronze protection extending from his head down towards his shins. His spear was long, often around 8 or 9 feet, and was used while standing shoulder to shoulder with the men on either side. The shields overlapped, each man protecting part of the next soldier's body as well as his own. The line advanced and withdrew as a unit, allowing the defenders to strike at the Persians while keeping their formation intact. When fighting became close and chaotic, the Greek soldiers relied on their armor, their discipline, and the sheer solidity of the line. Every part of the formation supported the rest. That was the central advantage of Thermopylae. On open ground, the Persian army could surround the Greeks, bring its superior numbers to bear, and attack from several directions. Inside the pass, there was no room to deploy the full mass of the army. Only a limited number of men could reach the defenders at any one time. The Persian soldiers at the front had to fight directly against the Greek shields and spears, while thousands more were trapped behind them, unable to contribute. The narrow channel therefore transformed the battle. It did not make the Greeks stronger than the Persians in absolute terms, but it prevented the Persians from using the strength they possessed. The defenders were still outnumbered by an immense margin, yet at the point where the fighting actually took place, the two sides could engage in something closer to equal numbers. The Persian attack struck the Greek wall, and the Greek wall refused to give way. The Persians had thousands upon thousands of troops, but numbers meant very little inside such a narrow pass. The soldiers were funneled directly towards the Greek wall of shields, where they began to fall in large numbers. Those who survived were forced to pull back. Xerxes gathered the men who had retreated and demanded to know what had happened. Their answer, in effect, was that the Greeks had formed a kind of human tank, an apparently immovable mass of shields, spears, and disciplined soldiers. Xerxes therefore decided to send in the Immortals. The Immortals were his elite guard, a force of 10,000 men kept ready for precisely this sort of crisis. They were regarded as the finest soldiers in the Persian army. Even they, however, could not break through the Greek line. The Spartans were disciplined with extraordinary severity. They held their position and at times pretended to retreat, drawing Persian soldiers forwards before turning back and crushing them. Persian troops were trained and equipped for fighting across open ground, but this cramped bottleneck gave them no room to use those strengths. They were cut down, and the surviving Immortals eventually withdrew as well. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass. On both the first and second days, wave after wave of Persian soldiers tried to force their way into the narrow entrance and were killed in the attempt. Persian archers fired into the fighting, but the confined space made their volleys far less effective. The cavalry was even more useless because horses could not provide any meaningful advantage in such terrain. The pass had stripped away nearly everything that normally favored the Persian army. Its weapons, its trained soldiers, and its overwhelming numbers all became almost irrelevant when confronted by that compact Greek wall. Then, the Greeks were betrayed. A local Greek called Ephialtes approached Xerxes and revealed the existence of a concealed mountain route known as the Anopeia Trail. The path curved around the Greek position and could bring an attacking force out behind it. The reasons for Ephialtes' decision remain disputed. Some accounts say that he acted for money. Others suggest that he was motivated by resentment or spite. Whatever his motive, the information transformed the situation. During the night, Xerxes ordered the Immortals to seize the mountain route. The Greeks had assigned about 1,000 Phoenician soldiers to guard it. Beneath the oak trees and in the darkness, the Immortals moved along the trail quietly and quickly. When the Phoenicians heard movement and realized that Persian troops were approaching, they withdrew towards higher ground. They assumed that the attack was directed against them and that they were about to be overwhelmed. The commander of the Immortals did not stop to pursue them. Instead, he continued along the trail towards the Greek rear. His aim was to pass behind Leonidas and the main Greek position, outflanking the defenders and trapping them between two Persian forces. During the night, deserters brought warnings to the Greeks. At dawn, Greek sentries came running down from the heights and confirmed the news. The Persians had found a way around them. Some of the Greek allies argued that the time had come to retreat. They had delayed the Persian advance for long enough, and the larger Greek forces farther south now had an opportunity to prepare. Leonidas refused to leave. He declared that he would remain where he was. Most of the Allied troops were therefore dismissed and sent away to safety. Those who stayed included the 300 Spartans, along with their helot attendants. The exact number of these enslaved or bound servants who fought beside them is disputed. 700 Thespians also refused to withdraw. In addition, 400 Thebans remained. Many of the Thebans may have been held there as hostages because they had previously tried to surrender, but they were still present when the final battle began. The Thespians in particular chose to stay when they could have gone. They accepted the danger and stood with Leonidas and his Spartans. Leonidas understood that the decision was almost certainly going to end in death. If he somehow succeeded, his name would be fixed in history. If he failed, he would die, and the Greek city-states could still be crushed by the Persian invasion. The stakes could hardly have been higher. Spartan law forbade retreat, and a soldier who abandoned his position could face death. Leaving the pass might preserve the lives of the remaining troops, but it could also destroy Greek morale. Leonidas believed that a final stand, even one that ended in slaughter, might give the Greeks a story powerful enough to unite them. Leonidas understood that the decision was almost certainly going to end in death. If he somehow succeeded, his name would be fixed in history. If he failed, he would die, and the Greek city-states could still be crushed by the Persian invasion. The stakes could hardly have been higher. Spartan law forbade retreat, and a soldier who abandoned his position could face death. Leaving the pass might preserve the lives of the remaining troops, but it could also destroy Greek morale. Leonidas believed that a final stand, even one that ended in slaughter, might give the Greeks a story powerful enough to unite them. The defenders had been outflanked and had already lost many men. At dawn, rather than waiting in the narrowest part of the pass, they advanced into a wider section. They wanted to meet the Persians in more open ground where they could fight with greater freedom. The result was a scene of complete disorder. Persian troops attacked from more than one direction. Spears snapped in the crush. Swords struck from every side, and when weapons were lost or broken, the fighting continued with daggers, fists, and teeth. Men grappled at close quarters, punching, grabbing, and trying to tear one another down in an all-out struggle to survive. It became less like an organized battle and more like a gigantic brawl. The Greeks were fighting for their lives, while the Persians pressed in from every direction. Leonidas was killed relatively early in the engagement. The two sides then fought fiercely over his body, each trying to claim or recover it amid the chaos of the battlefield. Eventually, the remaining Greeks were driven back to a small hill. Surrounded there, they had nowhere left to go. Persian archers brought the final phase of the resistance to an end, cutting down the last defenders with volleys of arrows. The stand at Thermopylae was over. Xerxes was furious. He ordered that Leonidas's body be beheaded and placed upon a stake. To the Greeks, mutilating the body of a dead enemy was a profound disgrace, so the act was especially shocking. That was precisely why Xerxes did it. The punishment was meant to humiliate Leonidas and send a message to anyone who might consider resisting Persian authority. Much later, after the war had ended and the Persians had been driven out of Greece, the Spartans raised a monument at the site. It took the form of a stone lion dedicated to Leonidas. They also carved an epitaph that has continued to move people for centuries. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The fighting at Thermopylae itself lasted 3 days. The Greek force had occupied and held the position for roughly 7 days altogether, however, if the waiting period before the main assault is included. Greek losses among the Persians may have reached around 20,000, although modern historians regard that figure as possibly exaggerated. The exact number cannot be known. Even so, the losses were clearly serious enough to shock Xerxes and the Persian army. The importance of the battle was not determined by the casualty figures alone. Thermopylae demonstrated that the Persian advance could be stopped, or at least delayed for a meaningful length of time. It showed that disciplined, free men could stand their ground against an enormous empire. The story of the stand became an inspiration to the wider Greek population and to the many Greek city-states that were now being called upon to resist. But the strategic cost was obvious. The pass had been lost, and the route towards Athens lay open. Once Thermopylae fell, there was no longer anything in central Greece capable of preventing the Persian army from sweeping south. Fear spread through Athens, and the very outcome that Leonidas had hoped to delay had become unavoidable. While Leonidas and his soldiers were fighting at Thermopylae, the Greek fleet was engaged against the Persian navy off the northern coast of Euboea. The two sides fought a series of naval actions over 3 days, but neither secured a decisive victory. Storms damaged Persian ships and weakened the fleet, yet the Greek position also became increasingly vulnerable once Thermopylae had fallen. The Greek fleet therefore withdrew to Salamis, where the waters were narrower and easier to defend. The retreat was necessary because the loss of Thermopylae had exposed the flank of the earlier naval position. Remaining there would have left the ships in a dangerously exposed location as the Persian army continued its advance. Meanwhile, Xerxes' army marched south through Boeotia. They burned every town that refused to submit, and by the end of September, the Persian army had arrived at Athens. Yet when the Persians entered the city, they discovered something they had not expected. Athens was entirely deserted. There was no civilian population waiting for them, no crowd of citizens to capture, and no organized force defending the streets. The city was simply empty. That evacuation had been ordered by Themistocles, the clever and sometimes ruthless Athenian leader who had persuaded the assembly to abandon the city altogether. It was an extraordinarily bold decision, and certainly a controversial one at the time. Athens, in 480 BC, may have had somewhere between 30 and 40,000 male citizens. Once women, children, slaves, and everyone else were included, the total population may have reached roughly 200,000 people. Moving an entire population was an enormous undertaking, but the Athenians had been given several weeks to get it done. The elderly and the women and children were sent away to nearby communities. Some were taken to places such as Aegina and Salamis, where they could be kept out of the path of the advancing army. Men of fighting age were expected to join the fleet or serve in the army. The livestock was moved as well. Anything valuable that could be carried or transported was taken away. The Athenians stripped the city of everything they could save, leaving behind little more than the buildings, the temples, and the walls themselves. Before they departed, however, the Athenians had consulted the oracle at Delphi. The priestess delivered a prophecy that seemed to describe disaster in absolute terms. Athens would fall, its people would be scattered, and fire would consume the city. A second consultation produced a more cryptic answer. It said that the wooden wall alone would not fail. There were different ways to understand that mysterious phrase. Some people believed it referred to the old wooden palisade on the Acropolis. Themistocles argued for a far more ambitious interpretation. In his view, the wooden wall was the fleet itself, the hulls of the ships that would carry Athens' defense beyond the city and into the sea. The assembly trusted his judgment, and the Athenians accepted that saving their people mattered more than saving their homes. As a result, the Persians found almost no resistance when they occupied Athens. The only defenders left behind were a small group of temple treasurers and some poorer citizens who had taken the oracle literally. They had barricaded themselves on the Acropolis behind wooden planks, convinced that the prophecy meant an actual wooden barrier rather than a fleet of ships. Their position could not hold for long. Persian troops stormed the Acropolis, killed the defenders, and plundered the temples. Then, they set fire to the city. The flames spread through Athens and consumed almost everything that remained. The older Parthenon, the temple dedicated to Athena, the treasuries, and even Athena's sacred olive tree were destroyed or badly damaged by the fire. Smoke rose in a vast column above the city, visible from across the water at Salamis. Many of the Athenian refugees were gathered there, and from the island they could watch their home burning. Athens had once been one of the busiest and most important cities in the ancient world. Now its streets and sanctuaries were being swallowed by flames raised by the invading Persian army. For the people watching from Salamis, this was not merely a military defeat. It was the destruction of the place that had shaped their entire lives, carried out in full view while they were powerless to stop it. Herodotus later recorded that Xerxes sent a messenger to Susa to announce that Athens had been captured. The city had humiliated Persia at the Battle of Marathon, and its destruction allowed Xerxes to claim that he had avenged the defeat suffered by his father Darius. The Persians had taken the city that had embarrassed their empire, and Xerxes had achieved the revenge he wanted, at least in appearance. For the Greeks watching the destruction from Salamis, the scene was devastating. It was the kind of image that could make an entire population believe the war was already lost. If one wants a modern comparison, it might be like watching Paris fall to an invading army while standing just outside the city, seeing its most recognizable landmarks and neighborhoods consumed by fire. Whatever comparison one chooses, the message would have been just as horrifying for the other Greek communities. If Athens could be occupied and destroyed, which city could possibly consider itself safe? The burning of Athens also created a serious strategic problem. Some commanders from the Peloponnese began arguing that the Greek forces should withdraw to Corinth. Their idea was to occupy the narrow strip of land there, fortify it, and abandon central Greece entirely. They believed the alliance could protect the Peloponnese by holding the narrow approach at Corinth, even if the rest of Greece had to be surrendered. It would give them a defensible position and, in their view, at least preserve a part of the Greek world from Persian control. The Athenians and their allies rejected that plan. Abandoning central Greece would mean leaving half the country permanently in Persian hands. Athens had already been sacrificed, its people had already been evacuated, and its buildings were already burning. To retreat even farther south would transform a temporary withdrawal into the surrender of an enormous portion of Greece. The question was no longer simply how to protect Athens, it was whether the alliance would stand and fight for the rest of the country or retreat behind a line that would leave millions of people and countless communities under Persian rule. This was the moment when the alliance began to tremble on the edge of collapse. Themistocles was under pressure from his own citizens, who wanted revenge and wanted the Persian army punished for what it had done to their city. They had watched Athens burn from Salamis, and they were not eager to let the attackers advance without a fight. But the Spartan commander Eurybiades leaned towards withdrawal. He favored moving back towards Corinth and accepting the loss of the northern and central regions rather than risking the entire coalition in a battle fought for Athens. Corinth and the other Peloponnesian states had their own concerns. They wanted to defend their lands, their families, and their cities. From their perspective, Athens had already been lost, and risking everything for a city that was now in ruins might have seemed reckless. They were not necessarily prepared to sacrifice the Peloponnese merely to recover ground that the Persians had already conquered. Their position was understandable, even if it directly conflicted with the Athenian demand to continue the fight. So the disagreement was becoming stark. Athens wanted to stand and fight. The other states were increasingly inclined to pull back, establish a strong defensive line, and avoid gambling the survival of all their remaining forces. One side feared that retreat would mean losing half of Greece forever. The other feared that refusing to retreat could mean losing all of it. Themistocles needed a decision, and he needed one quickly, because the next battle might either preserve the resistance or destroy it completely. The destruction of Athens was also part of a wider psychological campaign. Xerxes was not merely knocking down buildings or punishing a rebellious city. He was demonstrating what Persian power could do to anyone who opposed it. The message was brutally simple: resist, and your city would be destroyed along with everything you had ever known. Surrender, and you might survive while keeping your customs, your homes, and your way of life. That was the choice the Persians wanted the Greeks to believe they faced. The smoke rising from Athens made the cost of defiance impossible to ignore. Every Greek community could see what resistance might bring. The city had refused to submit, and the result was fire, death, and ruin. Persian power appeared overwhelming, while the Greek alliance was arguing among itself over where to make its stand. That was precisely the kind of fear the destruction was intended to create. But there was an important difference between capturing Athens and winning the war. The Persians had taken the city, yet the people themselves had escaped. The Athenian fleet was still intact, and the Greeks had not abandoned the struggle. The resistance remained alive, even though the city at its heart had been burned. The Persian army had achieved a dramatic victory, but its commanders still had decisions to make about how to finish the campaign. They had captured Athens, but the Greek fleet remained at sea, and as long as that fleet survived, the war was not over. Xerxes did not merely need another advantage. He needed a victory so complete that the Greek resistance would collapse. The Persian fleet had to be destroyed, and the remaining Greek armies had to be driven into surrender. Themistocles understood this perfectly. More importantly, he already knew where such a decisive engagement could take place. All that remained was to lure the Persians into the trap. To understand why Themistocles was capable of such a gamble, it helps to look at where he came from. He had not been born into Athens's powerful aristocratic families. His father, Neocles, was a relatively modest citizen, while his mother was not Athenian. Her precise origin is uncertain. The important point is simply that she came from somewhere outside Athens. That mattered in a society deeply preoccupied with ancestry, family connections, and inherited status. Themistocles, therefore, had no easy path into the city's upper ranks. He had to force his way upwards through a combination of charm, ruthlessness, political instinct, and, perhaps above all, exceptional intelligence. He entered public life while still comparatively young and built a following among the poorer citizens. At the same time, he proved capable of outmaneuvering rivals from the established ruling class, many of whom were far more comfortable with their inherited influence than with this ambitious outsider. His greatest political achievement began with a discovery in the silver mines. In 483 before the Common Era, a rich new vein was found. Most Athenians wanted the profits divided among the citizens. That would have been the obvious choice: take the wealth and distribute it directly. Themistocles argued for something entirely different. He persuaded the city to spend the money on warships, specifically the fast and heavily built vessels known as triremes. His case was that Athens needed a powerful navy. The Persians might already be preparing to come west, and Athens was also involved in continuing conflicts in the region around Aegina. At that moment, however, no one possessed complete certainty about what was coming. The Athenians sensed danger on the horizon, but they did not know exactly when the Persians would act, or what form the threat would take. This was still 3 years before the invasion actually began. Themistocles was making an extraordinary prediction, and his ability to persuade the city to prepare so early showed just how far ahead he was thinking. The new ships transformed Athens, but ships alone could not win a naval war. They needed crews, and each trireme required a large number of rowers. That was where the Thetes entered the story, the poorest class of Athenian citizens. In normal circumstances, men from this group had little access to political influence and were often excluded from the more prestigious forms of military service. The triremes changed their importance almost overnight. Rowing one of these vessels was not a simple matter of sitting down and pulling an oar. It demanded discipline, physical endurance, timing, and complete cooperation. Hundreds of men had to move together, maintaining a rhythm that allowed the ship to accelerate, turn, and strike effectively. The poorest citizens were now essential to the city's military power. Their labor placed real force behind their political importance. Democracy and naval strength began to reinforce one another. The political system gave these men a stake in Athens, while the fleet gave them a central role in defending it. That transformation was largely the work of Themistocles, who possessed a remarkably sharp understanding of people and circumstances. He recognized not only the danger posed by Persia, but also the weakness within the alliance opposing it. Sparta did not truly trust Athens, nor did many of the other Greek communities feel comfortable with Spartan leadership. They feared Persian conquest, certainly, but they also feared the possibility that Sparta might dominate Greece if the invasion were defeated. To some of them, the Spartans appeared almost as dangerous as the Persians, unruly, aggressive, and difficult to control. The alliance was therefore fragile. It existed because the threat of invasion was immediate, not because the Greek states had suddenly overcome their old rivalries. Themistocles knew that keeping the coalition together would require every political skill he possessed. He had to flatter the Spartans, pressure them, and manipulate them when necessary. The alliance could not be allowed to break apart before the Persians had been stopped. Even ancient writers who admired Themistocles' genius did not portray him as a virtuous saint. They described him as ambitious and deeply concerned with his own interests. Plutarch suggested that he valued the power of Athens more highly than personal honor, while also implying that he was intensely focused on his own advancement. In other words, his motives were not entirely selfless. He wanted Athens to survive, but he also wanted Athens to become stronger, and he wanted his own influence to rise with it. That combination of patriotism and personal ambition became crucial when Athens was burning. The city had been abandoned, and the Athenians could see smoke rising from the place they had called home. Their houses, temples, and streets were being consumed. The population was homeless, furious, and desperate for a chance to strike back. Yet the commanders from the Peloponnese wanted to withdraw southwards and concentrate on defending the approaches to Corinth. Themistocles refused to accept that retreat. He proposed fighting the Persians again, but not on ground chosen by the enemy. Instead, he wanted the next battle at Salamis, in the narrow strait separating the island from the mainland. The waters there were confined, and that mattered enormously. In an open sea battle, the Persians could exploit their numerical superiority. In the strait, their larger fleet would have far less room to maneuver. The Greek triremes could fight at close quarters, using the restricted waters to reduce the Persian advantage. The geography offered exactly what Themistocles needed, but the location would be useless unless the Persians could be made to attack there. He also had to prevent the Allied commanders from abandoning the position and retreating towards the south. His task was therefore twofold: bring Xerxes' fleet into the narrow waters under conditions favorable to the Greeks, and make sure the Greek fleet itself could not simply escape. At this point, Themistocles played his boldest card. It was the sort of plan that could look either brilliantly inspired or completely insane, depending on the result. He sent a trusted servant named Sicinus to the camp of Xerxes with a carefully prepared message. The message was a lie. According to Herodotus, Themistocles claimed that he was secretly loyal to Persia. Consider the absurdity of the story Xerxes was being asked to believe. Themistocles was the Athenian leader responsible for building and directing the strongest naval force in Greece. That fleet had already faced the Persians, and Athens itself had now been destroyed. Yet his messenger arrived and suggested that Themistocles was really on the Persian side. He wanted Xerxes to believe that the Greek fleet was frightened, divided, and preparing to slip away during the night. The supposed escape route led towards the Isthmus of Corinth. If Xerxes wanted to destroy the Greek fleet once and for all, the message claimed, he needed to close the exits from Salamis immediately. The Persian king was now presented with what seemed to be a priceless opportunity. A leading Greek commander was supposedly betraying his own side and revealing exactly how the enemy intended to escape. Xerxes accepted the story. What made the deception especially convincing was that it fitted everything his own informers had already been telling him. Persian spies had been watching the Greek communities and reporting that they were constantly quarreling. The Greeks, they said, were frightened by the Persian advance and could not agree on what to do. Their different states argued over where to stand, when to retreat, and which commander should be obeyed. Their political system appeared, from the outside, to be producing confusion rather than decisive action. So when Sicinus appeared with a message claiming that Themistocles was secretly loyal to Persia, it did not sound impossible. It confirmed the picture Xerxes already had in his mind. The Greeks seemed divided, terrified, and on the verge of breaking apart. The Persian king had no reason to suspect that the supposed betrayal was actually designed to make him act too quickly. That night, Xerxes ordered the great Persian fleet to move. Its task was to seal every possible route out of Salamis. Egyptian ships were sent around the island to block the western approaches and prevent the Greeks from escaping in that direction. The main Persian force took position across the entrance to the strait. Phoenician ships held one side, while the Ionian contingents were placed on the other. Slowly, the exits were covered and the net was drawn tight. By morning, the trap appeared complete. The Greek fleet was boxed in, with no obvious route of withdrawal. Xerxes could look down upon the operation and believe that victory was now within reach. The Greek ships would be rounded up, their naval threat eliminated, and the war brought to its decisive end. From the Persian point of view, Themistocles' message had delivered the enemy directly into their hands. What Xerxes had not understood was that he had been manipulated. Themistocles had succeeded in placing the Persian fleet inside the narrow waters where he wanted it. The Greek ships could no longer retreat, even if their commanders had wished to do so. Every exit had been closed by the Persian deployment. The very action Xerxes believed would guarantee his victory had removed the Greeks' ability to run. That also settled the argument among the Peloponnesian commanders. Before the trap was closed, they could still debate whether to withdraw towards Corinth. Once the Persians blocked the strait, there was no practical escape route left. The Allied fleet had to remain and fight. Themistocles had deliberately forced his own allies into the battle because he knew that if they were given another option, at least some of them would take it. In effect, he handed Xerxes a battle plan designed to make the Greek fleet stand its ground. He used the Persian king's confidence against him, allowing Xerxes to believe that he was choosing the moment and location of the engagement. In reality, the decision had been shaped by Themistocles from the beginning. He had outmaneuvered the enemy, but he had also outmaneuvered his own side, creating circumstances in which neither group could easily do anything except fight. The remarkable part is that the plan depended on a precise understanding of how the Athenian navy worked. The triremes were among the most effective pieces of military technology available in that age. They were not simply boats carrying soldiers. Their strength came from the coordinated effort of the crew. Roughly 170 rowers had to work in near-perfect rhythm, each stroke matching the next. If their timing broke down, the vessel lost speed and control. If they moved together, the ship became a fast and powerful weapon in the confined waters. They were roughly 90 feet long and perhaps 15 feet across, narrow, light, and exceptionally quick. At the bow sat a bronze ram built for one purpose: to smash into an opposing vessel. A ship struck by 2 or 3 of these rams at once could be sent straight to the seabed. These craft were fast, agile, and made to attack other boats head-on. Their weakness was that they were not built to absorb a blow anywhere else along the hull. A hit away from the reinforced prow could cause the whole vessel to split apart. One of the most important maneuvers was also one of the hardest to carry out. It has a Greek name that is difficult to pronounce, so let us call on a Greek friend for help. The maneuver was known as the dekplus. The idea was to row with enough force to pass through a gap in the enemy line, then turn sharply and drive the ram into the side or the stern of an opposing ship. In practice, it meant threading forward, swinging round, and coming back at precisely the right angle. Success demanded perfect timing, close cooperation, and someone directing the crews so that every man knew exactly when to act. Even highly trained sailors would have found it extremely difficult to execute. The Persian and Phoenician triremes were built on similar principles, although the Phoenician vessels were often lighter and faster. Greek triremes, by contrast, tended to be heavier and more robust, qualities that suited them to this ramming style of combat. Persian ships also frequently carried additional troops. Their marines were trained to leap aboard an enemy vessel and fight at close quarters. Persian commanders wanted to get near the opposing fleet, bring their larger numbers into play, and overwhelm their opponents with men. That approach could be highly effective in open water. Inside the twisting, constricted waters around Salamis, however, it became a serious disadvantage. It is worth remembering the pattern of the campaign. There had already been several places where geography favored the Greek defenders. The Hellespont was one such point. Thermopylae was another. Salamis was the final narrow passage in this sequence, and once again the landscape offered the Greeks a chance to hold back a much larger force. If they could keep control of this strait, they might still drive the Persians away for good. Themistocles understood that clearly. He knew how the Persian army and fleet were approaching the battle. Confident, stretched too far from their secure position, and perhaps so eager to destroy the Greeks that they had become overambitious. He also understood the condition of the Greek defenders. They were determined, but they were fighting from a position of desperation. Many of their families were watching from the shores of Salamis. The island had become a refuge for large numbers of Athenians who had abandoned their homes, and the people they loved were close enough to see the outcome for themselves. Themistocles recognized that victory would not be decided by courage alone. The crucial questions were who controlled the water, who chose the moment of engagement, and who could maintain the best position. This was political and military skill operating together. Whoever commanded the narrow channel would determine the fate of the war. That night, the Greek camp was tense, but it was not unfocused. The hoplites sat beside the torches and fires. The rowers stretched their tired bodies, preparing for the strain that awaited them. A few tried to sleep, though most found it impossible. Themistocles moved among the men, speaking quietly and offering reassurance whenever fear began to take hold. Everyone understood what the following morning meant. Imagine the night before the most important championship match of your life, then multiply that feeling beyond measure. This was not simply a contest that would bring honor or disappointment. It was a matter of life and death. The result would decide whether their city and their people survived with their glory intact, or whether they faced total destruction, along with the ruin of their families, their homes, and everything they knew. As morning approached, the sun began to show itself above the horizon. It was early in September, and a thin mist lay across the water. Through it, the oars could be seen dropping into the sea, one after another. On one side stood the Greek fleet, numbering somewhere between 370 and 380 vessels. The crews were exhausted, but they were ready to perform the duty demanded of them. Opposite them was the Persian armada, perhaps twice as large, possibly larger still. From the Greek position, the horizon seemed filled with Persian ships. Herodotus later claimed that the invaders possessed more than 1,200 warships. That figure is probably an exaggeration, but even a force of 600 to 800 vessels would have been immense, and still roughly twice the number available to the Athenians. The imbalance was unmistakable. In terms of sheer numbers, the Persians held the advantage, and most observers expected them to crush the Greek fleet before the day was over. Xerxes had arranged for a throne to be placed on the slopes of a nearby mountain, where he could look down over the strait and watch the battle. From that position, he intended to note which commanders fought with distinction and which showed fear. The Persian captains knew that their king was observing them. His presence encouraged them to advance aggressively, because every officer understood that hesitation might be noticed and remembered. The Strait of Salamis ran approximately from the northeast towards the southwest. At its narrowest point, it contracted to less than 2 kilometers. The confined space was exactly what the Greeks needed. They positioned their vessels along the shoreline, with some ships drawn up on the beach and others anchored close to land. Rather than meeting the Persian force in a broad expanse of open water, they made use of the surrounding terrain and the restricted channel. As the Persian fleet came in from the east, the Greek triremes moved into their battle formation. Approximately 180 Athenian ships occupied the left flank. The Spartans and the other Peloponnesian contingents formed the right. A historian who took part in the wider events later dramatized the battle in his play The Persians, and according to that account, the Greeks began by singing a hymn to Apollo. Its sound traveled across the water, binding the rowers and the fighting men together before the attack began. Then, at the first light of day, with the sun just beginning to clear the horizon, the Greek ships surged forward. The clash that would decide the war was underway. You can almost picture the scene. Men who had been fighting for weeks, and in some cases preparing for years, finally reaching the moment for which all that training had been intended. They were on the water on a cool September morning, listening to hymns addressed to their God, knowing that the struggle before them was the culmination of their entire lives. Their city, their families, and their homeland lay behind them. There was no more preparation to make and no further delay possible. This was the moment to act. The Phoenician squadrons led the Persian advance. These were experienced sailors with many years of naval knowledge, yet even they found themselves trapped inside the narrow passage. The waterway twisted, leaving little room to maneuver and making it difficult for the captains to keep their lines in order. Ships approaching from behind continued to press forwards, eager to join the fighting. Instead of strengthening the attack, their impatience created confusion. Vessels collided, oars became tangled, and rowing oars snapped under the pressure. The carefully arranged formations began to dissolve. The Greek triremes, however, maintained their discipline and took advantage of the disorder. Their rowers drove the ships ahead with all their strength. At the waterline, the bronze rams struck the Persian hulls. Once the wooden sides were pierced, seawater rushed into the damaged vessels. Some ships overturned almost immediately. Others began to sink more gradually, leaving the rowers trapped at their benches as the water rose around them. For the men thrown into the sea, the danger did not end when their ships were destroyed. Most of the Persians could not swim, and many simply drowned. A considerable number of the Greeks, despite wearing heavy bronze armor, possessed at least enough swimming ability to make for a nearby shore. The geography that had restricted the Persian fleet now gave those Greek survivors somewhere to reach. The strait became a vast, violent confusion. Broken planks, shattered oars, and the bodies of dead soldiers spread across the surface. The larger engagement quickly fractured into hundreds of separate struggles between individual ships. Triremes darted between one another, circling and changing direction as their crews searched for an opening. They attempted the difficult maneuver described earlier, slipping past an opponent and turning back towards its vulnerable side or stern so that the bronze ram could strike the hull. Whenever ships became locked together, the fighting changed again. The Marines leapt across the gaps between the vessels, boarding enemy decks and engaging in close combat. The battle was no longer a single ordered advance, but a mass of isolated collisions, desperate boardings, and ships trying to free themselves before another ram found its target. The fighting had become a savage, close-quarters struggle aboard these tiny ships. Corinthian warriors were now grappling with Persian soldiers, and blood ran across the wooden decks and dripped into the sea, staining sections of the water a vivid red. On the Greek right, the pressure was building. Athenian and Corinthian vessels were forcing Persian squadrons back towards the shore. In the center of the strait, the situation was even more confused. Persian ships trying to escape were crashing into vessels that were still attempting to enter the battle, creating a mass of wreckage, collisions, and panic. The numerical superiority that had seemed so useful to the Persians was turning against them. They had too many ships packed into too little water, and their crews lacked the room and discipline needed to preserve a proper formation. Themistocles had anticipated precisely this problem. In open water, the Persian fleet could have spread out, surrounded the Greeks, and worn them down by sheer weight of numbers. Inside this narrow channel, however, numbers had lost their meaning. The geography had neutralized the advantage of the larger force, much as it had in the earlier fighting on land. A smaller force could hold a strong position, and once the space itself prevented an enemy from using its strength, having more men or ships no longer guaranteed anything. The vessels were now getting in one another's way. Even the experienced Phoenician captains, among the best sailors in the Persian fleet, could not maneuver properly amid the congestion. Xerxes had committed his entire navy to a stretch of water that could barely accommodate half of it. The fleet's greatest strength had become a trap. Ships could not turn without obstructing their allies, and vessels attempting to withdraw only made the disorder worse for those still pressing forward. The battle continued for hours, but eventually the Persian fleet began to break apart. Some ships fled eastwards towards Phalerum, while others were driven onto the Attic coast. Their crews had to swim for safety or struggle ashore beneath a storm of Greek arrows. Hundreds of Persian sailors and marines were drowned. The Greeks had probably lost around 40 ships. The Persian losses were roughly 200 and perhaps even more. Xerxes watched the disaster from his throne on a mountainside, looking down over the sea. The empire that had crossed the Hellespont by means of extraordinary engineering had defeated the Spartans at Thermopylae, destroyed Athens, and burned the city to the ground. It had brought together what was described as the largest army ever assembled. Yet that immense enterprise was now being undone, not because the Greeks possessed a larger army or greater physical power, but because their commander had outthought the Persian leadership. The Greeks had not surpassed the Persians in strength, courage, or fighting ability. They had simply used the circumstances more intelligently. Their victory came from planning, timing, and the careful use of the landscape and the water around them. That night, Greek soldiers and sailors rested among the wreckage. Bodies continued to wash up along the shore for days, and the waters around Salamis seemed to reek of death. Even so, the Greek fleet was still capable of fighting. The Persian navy, by contrast, had been crippled and effectively rendered useless. Xerxes could no longer rely on the sea to supply his army or to protect its lines of communication. Winter was approaching, and trying to keep such a vast force in hostile territory throughout the colder months would have been close to a death sentence. Within a matter of weeks, Xerxes therefore began withdrawing from Greece. He left a substantial army behind under the command of his finest general, Mardonius. Mardonius would spend the winter in Thessaly, while Xerxes returned to Asia with a large part of the invasion force. The Persian king was retreating, but the war was not yet over, because Mardonius still possessed a powerful and highly trained army. During the winter between 480 and 479 years before Christ, Mardonius reorganized his troops in Thessaly and prepared another attempt to break the Greek resistance. He also made an offer to Athens. The Athenians, he suggested, could retain complete autonomy and continue governing themselves as they had before. Persia would even provide gold to help rebuild their ruined city. All they had to do was form an alliance with the Persian Empire. If they cooperated, he promised, Athens would not be destroyed again. The Athenians refused. Their answer reflected the extraordinary pride and determination that had emerged from the invasion. They would not accept Persian protection in exchange for submission, even when the offer included money and the chance to restore their city. By the summer, Mardonius marched south once more and burned what remained of Athens for a second time. Once again, the Athenians abandoned the city and fled towards the Peloponnese. The final confrontation took place at Plataea, a town in Boeotia. A united Greek army, commanded by the Spartan leader Pausanias and reinforced by contingents and allies from across mainland Greece, finally met the Persians in open battle. The fighting was fierce, but the result was decisive. Mardonius, the commander of the elite Persian force, was killed, and the Persian line collapsed. According to the historian Herodotus, Greek forces struck another blow on that same day. They attacked and destroyed the remains of the Persian fleet on the Ionian coast. Whether the two events actually occurred at exactly the same time is uncertain, but the broader result is unmistakable. Xerxes' grand invasion of Greece was over. Athens recovered from the ashes far more quickly than anyone might have expected. The destruction had not broken the city. In some ways, it gave the Athenians a renewed sense of purpose. They raised new temples, rebuilt their walls, and developed ambitions that reached well beyond the city they had lost. Athens was reconstructed as something greater and more confident than it had been before the invasion. Out of the aftermath came the Delian League, a defensive alliance led by Athens and established to guard the Greek world against another Persian attack. Over time, however, the alliance changed into something very different, an Athenian empire. Silver from the Laurium mines provided money, a powerful navy gave Athens military reach, and the democratic energy of its citizens helped turn the city into the dominant power in the Aegean. Sparta, meanwhile, began turning inward. The Spartans had led the Greek resistance through its darkest period, but after the danger had passed, they withdrew into suspicion and isolation. Their attention became focused less on leadership abroad and more on keeping their enslaved Helot population under control. Sparta was always conscious that a revolt among the Helots could threaten the entire state, so maintaining order at home mattered more than expanding its influence overseas. By 460 years before Christ, mistrust between Athens and Sparta had hardened into open hostility. That hostility eventually erupted into the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict that shattered the Greek world and brought the Athenian Golden Age to an end. It was, in effect, a Greek civil war. The former allies who had resisted Persia were now competing for power against one another. Yet Thermopylae and Salamis remained alive in the memories of the people who had witnessed them and in the stories passed down to later generations. They became more than military engagements. They became myths, and those myths became tools for building a shared national identity. Thermopylae came to represent courage and sacrifice. 300 men holding a mountain pass against one of the largest armies ever assembled became an enduring image of duty and honor. The Spartans had not retreated. They had chosen to die in battle for their people. The precise details of what happened mattered less and less beside the symbolic meaning attached to the stand. Thermopylae represented the willingness to sacrifice everything for the community. Salamis, on the other hand, came to stand for intelligence and strategy, the triumph of thought over brute force. It became a version of David facing Goliath, with the smaller opponent winning through cleverness, adaptability, and a readiness to bend conventional rules when that was necessary for victory. Together, these two victories shaped the way Greeks viewed themselves for generations. The Persian Wars became an origin story about freedom and democracy resisting tyranny, and about civilizations standing against barbarism. Later generations stretched that story into a broader conflict between the West and the East. It was propaganda, like so much else in the construction of national memory, but it was powerful propaganda for the people of ancient Greece. It offered them a heroic explanation of who they were and why their political values mattered. The Persians, however, were not monsters. Their empire was an empire like any other, and empires are rarely harmless institutions. They conquer, exploit, and impose their authority. At the same time, the Persian system could be efficient and, in certain respects, unusually tolerant for its age. Peoples who submitted to Persian rule were often allowed to retain their own customs and local identities. The condition was obedience to the empire. But history is usually written by those who win, and in this case, the Greek version of events survived. That interpretation echoed through the centuries. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia, he presented his campaign as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens. After he burned Persepolis, he claimed that the destruction was an act of justice. During the Enlightenment, thinkers in Europe used Thermopylae and Salamis to demonstrate free societies have continued to draw strength from the idea that they can stand up to dictatorships and autocratic rulers. Even now, when nations find themselves facing apparently impossible odds, they still reach for the names of Thermopylae and Salamis as symbols of resistance. Yet, as with almost every famous war story, the legacy is complicated. Such stories celebrate courage and give a community a straightforward tale that it can pass down and hold on to. At the same time, they can bend the truth. Persians become bloodthirsty villains, while Greeks are transformed into almost flawless heroes. Beneath all that myth-making, though, something genuine remains. The belief that a small, determined people can challenge an empire, change what seems possible, and perhaps even overturn the odds. The deeper message is that courage combined with intelligence can allow the weaker side to prevail. That feeling of freedom, however delicate it may be, is still worth remembering. There is an important qualification to all of this. Nearly everything we know about the conflict between Greece and Persia comes to us through the Greek side, above all through Herodotus, one of the best-known historians of the ancient world. He wrote his account several decades after the wars were over. He traveled, questioned people, collected different versions of events, and made a serious attempt to distinguish what had really happened from what had already become legend. But he was not a historian in quite the same sense that we understand the profession today. From the Persian perspective, almost nothing comparable survives. We have very few records and no substantial collection of first-hand Persian accounts that allows us to balance the Greek narrative. So the version of the war that has reached us is, overwhelmingly, a Greek version of the story. That does not make it worthless, but it does make the perspective essential to understanding. Herodotus himself recognized that some of the stories he recorded might not be true. He openly admitted that certain details had been exaggerated. His figures, including claims about Persian armies numbering in the millions, do not stand up particularly well when tested against what historians consider logistically possible. He arranged the material around the themes that mattered to him: Greek unity, Persian arrogance and barbarism, and the influence of the gods upon human affairs. In that framework, the famous 300 Spartans became the central image. They were not actually alone, of course. Other Greek forces fought beside them. But as the years passed, the story became cleaner and more dramatic: Sparta against an empire. In the narrowest sense, the famous number is still accurate. 300 Spartan soldiers were present, supported by Greek allies. The simplified version merely pushes those allies into the background. The same problem applies to the size of Xerxes' army. Modern historians generally place the Persian force somewhere in the region of 200,000 to 300,000 men. That was an enormous army by the standards of the time, but it was not the endless human sea described in the most dramatic passages of Herodotus. The grand speeches attributed to Leonidas, the private debates about strategy, and other memorable exchanges may not have taken place in precisely the form in which they were later written. They were probably shaped by the storytelling habits and myth-building of succeeding generations. We should also remember that the Persian side remains largely unknown to us, leaving enormous gaps in the picture. Even so, these accounts continue to matter, and they remain worth retelling. The central idea still speaks to something recognizable in human history: a small coalition standing in the path of a vastly more powerful enemy. The Spartans were defeated at Thermopylae, but their stand bought time. That delay helped protect Athens and saved the lives of countless Athenians. Later, the strategy used at Salamis helped turn the wider conflict towards a Greek victory. People do not remember these events only because of troop numbers or military calculations. They remember the emotion of them. Even when defeat appears certain, Refusing to surrender your ground can carry meaning. Neither Thermopylae nor Salamis was simply the fulfillment of destiny. Their outcomes depended on a tangled mixture of weather, luck, human ingenuity, betrayal, storms, and individual decisions. A single mistake could have destroyed the Greek resistance and placed the whole of Greece under Persian control. Had that happened, the history we are discussing would have been an entirely different story. The men who fought in these battles eventually became legends, but before they were turned into symbols, they were ordinary people. They included farmers, sailors, craftsmen, and soldiers with very different motives. Some were driven by honor. Others fought because there was no realistic way to avoid it. What they shared was the decision, however temporary, to stand together. For one crucial moment, that united resistance stopped an empire. Yet the remarkable unity that appeared in 479 before Christ did not last. Once the immediate danger had passed, Athens and Sparta returned to treating one another as enemies. The suspicion and rivalry that had been growing between them for generations proved too strong to overcome. The same city-states that had fought side by side against Persia later helped tear Greece apart. In time, the divided Greek world was conquered by the Macedonians, and the rise of Alexander the Great transformed the political landscape yet again. The story did not end with the collapse of Greek independence. In the centuries that followed, Greek ideas changed the world in ways that reached far beyond the battlefield. Philosophy, art, and theater flourished, alongside new ways of thinking about political power, citizenship, and the organization of a state. The notion that people might govern themselves and that a democratic system could resist tyranny continued to influence societies long after the original wars had become ancient history. Those ideas still shape political arguments in the present day. The memory of this period in Greek history later inspired revolutionaries in North America and contributed, in complicated ways, to the political identity of the United States as it developed into a global power. Perhaps the most important lesson of Thermopylae and Salamis is that the Greeks were not rescued by gods acting on their behalf. In the long run, their survival depended on ordinary people who were willing to fight for what they believed mattered. Resistance does not always produce victory. Thermopylae itself ended in defeat. Sometimes, however, resistance changes the future. There can be value in a brief moment of defending your community, your principles, and the people you love, even when the cost is extraordinarily high. That is the human reality beneath the famous story of the 300 and beneath the wider conflict between Greece and Persia in 480 before Christ. It is a remarkable history. The Greek side has every reason to feel proud of what those people achieved. There is even a famous line associated with Winston Churchill. Instead of saying that Greeks fight like heroes, say that heroes fight like Greeks. It is the sort of phrase that turns a complicated historical event into a source of identity and pride. But was this something you learned as a matter of course in a Greek school, or was the history already something you were especially interested in? The answer is that Greek education places a great deal of emphasis on these stories. Students hear about the wars with Persia, about Salamis, and about the heroic resistance. The teaching can sometimes make it sound as though Greek history moves from those battles directly to the next convenient landmark. The more difficult centuries in between tend to receive less attention. The school version might move from the conflict between Greece and Persia to the victory of the Greek football team in the 2004 European Championship, as though the intervening history could be skipped altogether. Then come the Pythagorean theorem and Plato, followed by Socrates, and somehow the lesson arrives back at the European Championship. The debt crisis, austerity, and the more painful economic chapters of modern Greece are not quite given the same heroic treatment. They are brushed aside with the argument that those details do not matter for the story being told. A nation won the European tournament, and thousands of years earlier its soldiers fought several famous battles. For the purposes of patriotic storytelling, that can seem like more than enough. There is a certain appeal in that kind of pride. Every country wants to feel that its own history contains something exceptional. Some nations do not have a European championship to celebrate, while Greece has that victory, as well as the ancient battles, the philosophers, and the stories of resistance. That is a considerable collection of achievements. People often like to meet someone who can say, without hesitation, that their country is the best. They may acknowledge that other nations have done impressive things, but they still want to insist that their own comes first. Nationalism is a complicated word, and in many conversations it immediately sounds dangerous or unpleasant. There are certainly forms of nationalism that become hostile and destructive. But there is also a more ordinary kind of attachment, the pleasure people take in the history and identity of the place they come from. It can be enjoyable to meet Ethiopians who proudly point out that their country was never conquered. It can be equally entertaining to meet Russians who say, with complete confidence, that their people are the toughest in the world. Those declarations are often less about making a serious political argument than about celebrating a shared past. The trouble begins when those old victories are dragged into every modern conflict because contemporary politics is much messier. Present-day disputes involve power, ideology, economics, and competing interests, and the simple heroic language of the ancient world no longer fits so neatly. Still, there is something satisfying about looking back and saying that, at one particular moment, your people held their ground and defeated the Persians. It turns a complicated past into a clear memory of survival. And then comes the inevitable joke: where is Persia now? It has become something else, a different political entity, and even that answer leads into modern politics, where the history is no longer quite so simple. There is a certain pleasure in looking back at Greece and realizing that, in some form, Greece is still there. The names, the places, and the cultural legacy have survived, even though the land and its people passed through the hands of many different powers. Crete, for instance, is still a real place, and it is remarkably beautiful. Of course, Crete was conquered by the Nazi regime, as well as by various other powers at different points in its history, but that does not erase the older stories attached to it, or the way those stories continue to capture the imagination. That is probably why ancient wars are so easy to become fascinated by. They offer heroism, legendary figures, dramatic sacrifices, and the atmosphere of myth, while seeming to keep the political arguments at a safe distance. A modern listener can hear about a famous battle and enjoy the courage and spectacle without having any personal stake in the outcome. We can cheer for the Greeks, or for the Spartans, and say, with genuine enthusiasm, that these people were willing to die for what they believed. At the same time, there is an uncomfortable reality beneath that heroic version of the past. How many Persian mothers may have buried sons who had been compelled to fight? How many of those soldiers were serving under conditions that amounted to indenture rather than freely choosing a glorious adventure? Those possibilities are part of the same history. The men celebrated in the stories were not simply figures in a clean legend, they were also people caught inside systems of power, obligation, and violence. Even the Greek side cannot be separated from its own conflicts. The Spartans and their allies eventually turned against Athens, and the Greek world endured a major civil war that killed enormous numbers of people across the Peloponnese. If we were living through that conflict, it would be impossible to treat it as a harmless story. Families would have been divided, cities damaged, and ordinary people forced to bear the consequences of decisions made by leaders and armies. Yet, from the distance of the present, someone with no personal connection to those events can still read about them as history and feel the pull of the narrative without being directly entangled in its rivalries. That distance changes the experience. It allows us to recognize the suffering and the contradictions while still appreciating the drama of the stories. We can admire the determination associated with Sparta, the military and political struggles surrounding Athens, and the larger tradition of Greek warfare without pretending that the ancient world was morally simple. The admiration does not require us to approve of every action carried out by the people involved. It comes from understanding how powerful these stories became and why they continued to be retold. And Greece left far more behind than accounts of battles. Its influence reaches into philosophy, literature, political thought, drama, and the idea of democracy. The plays and arguments produced by Greek societies became part of the vocabulary through which later generations tried to understand politics, ethics, art, and human nature. Even the arguments between rival cities helped create a historical record filled with personalities, ambitions, loyalties, betrayals, and competing visions of how a community should be organized. That combination is what makes the subject so enduring. Greek history contains real institutions and real wars, but it also acquired the shape of legend. A person can approach it through the stories of soldiers and commanders, through the development of philosophy and theater, or through the long struggle between different Greek communities. The same past can appear heroic in one account, tragic in another, and deeply troubling when the experience of the ordinary people is brought back into view. The ancient war stories are therefore not valuable simply because they provide convenient heroes to cheer for. They show how societies remembered courage, how they explained sacrifice, and how later generations selected certain episodes while overlooking others. They let us feel the force of the myth while still asking what that myth leaves out. The mothers who lost their sons, the people compelled to fight, the civilians caught between rival powers, and the communities destroyed by wars among Greeks themselves. Those tensions remain present whenever the stories of Greece and Sparta are told.